So I had a very interesting message come through to me today that I wanted to share with all of you. It was super random. I totally feel like God brought this to my attention just out of nowhere. I was literally just in the bathroom doing my makeup, and all of a sudden I heard, "You are not meant to live in fear." That we as humans are not meant to live in fear. And out of nowhere, my thought went from that to the story of Adam and Eve. And I don't really read the Bible much. I am Christian. I'm terrible at reading it because I tend to fall asleep in it. So it's not normal or typical for me to get messages like that and then think of stories in the Bible. So I ended up going and reading the story of Adam and Eve again, because I felt like God was trying to draw me to that and give me a message for all of you and a message for myself too. So keep that in mind while I'm going through this video, that we were never meant to live in fear. And so when I looked at the story of Adam and Eve, which for reference, is like Genesis chapter 2. So after God makes heaven and earth and all the plants and animals and everything, he makes Adam, puts him in the Garden of Eden, and he tells Adam, and most of us know this, but I'm just sharing it for context. He tells Adam, you can eat from any trees in the garden except for the tree of the fruit of knowledge of, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And he says, "But you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat from it, you will certainly die." And, as the story goes, we know then God makes Eve and they both eat from it. They don't die. But I thought it was interesting because after God tells Adam not to eat from it, then it goes into the story of how God makes Eve for Adam as his helper, so he won't be alone. And chapter 2 ends with this phrase, which I found really interesting. It says, "Adam and his wife were both naked and they felt no shame." And I want you to stick a pin in that because we're going to come back to it. Okay? Adam and his wife were both naked and they felt no shame. And it makes a point of pointing that out to us. Pointing that out to us. So the very next thing after that in chapter 3 is the story we're very familiar with the serpent deceiving Eve, getting her to, eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. She takes the fruit, and the serpent deceives her by telling her, "You will not certainly die." He says, it's Genesis, chapter 3, verse 4. "You will not certainly die," the serpent said to the woman, "for God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." Which means prior to this, Adam and Eve were not aware of good and evil, right? They were in this beautiful garden, just living their lives, and they felt no shame at being naked. They weren't aware of these things. So then the next thing that happens, Eve eats the fruit. Adam is apparently with her, and she gives some to him, and he eats it too, right? So it says after that, so this is Genesis chapter 3, verse 7. "Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves." So now suddenly they went from being naked and having no shame to realizing they're naked and feeling weird about it and made clothes for themselves. And please bear with me. I promise I will get to the fear part that I started this video with, but I promise this will all make sense. So right after that, so after they make their clothes, then it says in the next verse, verse 8, "Then the man and his wife heard the sound of the Lord God as he was walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and they hid. They hid from the Lord God among the trees of the garden." And then God calls out to Adam, "Where are you?" And Adam answers, and this is interesting, "I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid." So now you have them feeling shame over being naked, and now they're afraid of God and hiding from him because they're naked. Okay, so there's shame, there's fear, right? And then, God says to them, "Who told you that you were naked?" Right? Because they weren't aware of what this meant before, that it was a bad thing or not. He says, "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree that I commanded you not to eat from?" And then the next thing is Adam, throwing Eve under the bus of, well, the woman you put me here with, she gave me some fruit, so I ate it. So they admit that they both ate this. And then after that, that's when, God realizes the serpent deceived Eve, because she tells him that, and he curses the serpent, and then he curses Eve and women in general that will have, terrible pains during, childbearing and labor, and that it says your desire will be for your husband and he will rule over you. So God curses, women in a way, and curses man. But the whole point that and then they're banished from the garden at that point too, right? They're banished out of the Garden of Eden, where they were supposed to be living and enjoying their lives, and, where God placed them. So my point in sharing that and bringing this up was that when God told me this morning we were not meant to live in fear, and then pointed me to the story of Adam and Eve, I found it was so interesting that, before they ate the fruit, we were supposed to just live in this beautiful place, I guess you could say live in peace and blissful ignorance, and, be closer to God and with God, and just, care for this garden and rule over the earth or whatever. And then because we disobeyed God and ate from the tree, now suddenly we could see good and evil. We understood that evil existed. We knew what it was. We could recognize it. And I thought it was really interesting that before eating from the tree, Adam and Eve didn't feel shame. They didn't have fear. They didn't feel guilt. None of those things, because none of those things come from God. None of those things come from God. And when I was thinking about this and thinking about our own lives and how, there's so many ways that presents itself in our life, that we fear things we do not understand. We fear making choices that might better our lives because, maybe it's fear of the unknown. We don't know what's on the other side or what's going to happen after that. And we hold ourselves back from so many things, or, we feel guilt about things we've done in the past, even if, we can't change them and all we can do is learn from those mistakes and move forward. We keep living in guilt and allow ourselves to be trapped in that. And, how much shame can come into our lives, maybe shame over something we did or said. And I just was thinking about how none of that was ever meant to be for us. We were never supposed to find ourselves, living in fear, shame, guilt, anything along those lines, anything that was negative and evil. We were not supposed to have that life. And now when I think about when I would first learn about the story of Adam and Eve and, the serpent, and they ate from the tree and whatever, whether it was Sunday school, church, or coming up in random ways, growing up, anytime I would hear that, there would always be, some boy in the class or in church that would immediately be like, oh yeah, the woman ruined it for everyone, always blaming it on the woman. Even though, just want to point out, Adam was actually the first one made and the first one told not to eat from the tree. And yes, Eve screwed up and ate from it, but she gave some to Adam. Adam could have said no, he ate it too. So side note, men are just as guilty. Anyway, I digress. But when I was thinking about that story though, it just made me feel like, there's so much fear and guilt and shame and other negative things in our lives now. And I feel like people look at that story and think, oh, well, once they ate the fruit, it was over. That was it for humanity. Our hope was lost. Now we're all just screwed. And to an extent, yeah, we have to live through a ton of crap now that we wouldn't have otherwise. Women have to have very painful childbirth, and men and women were cursed in ways. But at the same time, even though we're forced to exist and live in the knowledge of good and evil and seeing evil in our world every day and experiencing it and suffering and pain and lies and all of that, at the same time, remember in the verses I read that God told them they would die if they ate from that fruit. And the serpent says, you will not certainly die. And guess what? They didn't die, not physically, right? Adam and Eve both ate from the fruit. Neither of them died physically, but metaphorically, they died. Spiritually, they died. And I think it was more the death of their innocence, the death of the innocence that we were all supposed to have as humans, that God was trying to spare us from the pain and the suffering and evil and fear and shame and guilt and all of those things, because that's not what he wanted for us. God loves us and he did not want those things for us. But because we disobeyed, just like a parent has to discipline their children in some way, he did that. And even though it seems kind of harsh, like, he's God, he can do what he wants. So he chose to discipline us in that way. But because God also loves us, there's always a way out of that. Now we can't, reverse what they did. We can't reverse, how he cursed men and women after that. But in our own lives, I think in our own lives, when we experience fear over something or shame or guilt, we allow ourselves to stay trapped in those things, and it prevents us from living our lives, from experiencing joy, from forgiving ourselves, forgiving others. I think that there's still that way out. God doesn't want us to be afraid. He doesn't want us to be trapped and be depressed or angry or suffering and having pain in our lives. So I think I hope all this makes sense. I'm sorry if I'm rambling. I'm trying to form all this in my brain. But I think that even though God kicked Adam and Eve out of the garden and he made our way in life harder, he didn't make it impossible. And I think we may not be able to live blissfully in peace in that beautiful Garden of Eden anymore, but we are able to still experience joy and peace and love in our lives. It's just harder now because we're exposed to evil because of that. So I think that, when I said we are not meant to live in fear, we were never meant to live in fear, but the fact is that we have that now. So how do we overcome that? In other words, how do we find the courage and strength in ourselves to overcome our fears, to keep moving forward, to have more faith, to, shine our light in the world and keep persevering no matter what comes our way and what tries to tear us down. And God, I hope this is making sense. I hope that all of you will think about that story, and rather than looking at that as it happened, humanity's screwed, life sucks now, we're all doomed. Look at it as, we can still find joy and peace and not feel shame and fear about things. It's just harder now. It's just harder. So it requires more from us, more strength, more perseverance, more reliance on God, reliance on ourselves, more trusting in ourselves to get through things in life that try to tear us down or make us scared or hold us back from things. And so I just hope that you take that to heart, what I said. Sit on that for a little bit, sit with that, and just realize that although those evil things exist in our world and exist in our lives, that we still have the power of free will, just like Eve did with eating the apple, and Adam, they had used their free will to eat not that was an apple, but the piece of fruit. It doesn't specifically say an apple, but the piece of fruit. They had the free will to do that, and we still have free will. So we can choose now to overcome our fears. We can choose to not feel shame. We can choose to forgive ourselves and move forward and learn from our mistakes. And we can choose to be better people and to find happiness in our lives and do the things that make us happy. And we can choose to show kindness to others. And we don't have to let fear, guilt, shame, and all these other things control our lives and stop us from being the best versions of ourselves that we can become. Okay, so whatever it is you might be going through when you're watching this, just know that no matter how bad things are, there's always a choice. There's choosing to move forward in times of uncertainty. There's choosing to forgive someone who wronged you or forgive yourself for something that you've done. There's so many ways that you can get out of the situations that you're in, or maybe it's something you're grieving, a loss, there's ways that you can learn to eventually move forward from that and, try to find positive things in your life to hold on to, or, you know, to build a good life for yourself. And anyway, I'm sorry, I'm probably just rambling at this point, but I was really struck by that this morning, because I was just sitting there in the bathroom doing my makeup, no big deal. And all of a sudden, like, this came to me that we are not meant to live in fear, and the story of Adam and Eve. And it was just really strong at the moment, because I just had never looked at it that way before, of you know, even what they went through. Like, God didn't want that for us. He was protecting us from that tree. He didn't want us to know pain and suffering and fear and all of that. But now that we do, you know, it doesn't mean that we're doomed forever. There are ways we can still move forward and overcome those things and battle them. And we can do that by being strong in ourselves and being courageous and resilient, and also by trusting in God and leaning on God when things get hard and when we need help, because He does still love us and He does want good things for us. And so I just pray that whoever watches this, you know, that this message will reach whoever needs to find it, and that you will get something out of it, and that you'll be better for it, and you'll just, have less fear in your life, and don't allow that to control you, control your situation. And I think I've rambled enough. So I hope you guys have a good rest of your day, and I'll talk to you soon.